Today we are going to be going through the general adaptation syndrome, or something that all of us like to refer to as stress. So, tell you a little story. There was a doctor who liked to dabble in science, and his name was Dr. Hans Selye. And Dr. Selye decided that he wanted to do some research looking at the reproductive system of females and to look at changes in estrogen and progesterone levels during pregnancy, things like that. And so Dr. Selye got a big grant and he set up this research lab, and he decided he was going to work on rats and look at changes in hormone levels in rats. But Dr. Selye had never worked with rats before and didn't realize he was scared to death of rats. So once all his rats came in and he found out, that he'd have to pick these rats up, and one of the ways that you test for hormone levels in a rat is you get them to pee. And it's really easy to get a rat to pee. You just pick a rat up, you turn it over on its belly, you rub its belly, and the sucker pees. I mean, I don't understand it. It's like this rat thing, okay? And so he found out he'd have to pick those rats up and hold them in his hand and rub their belly and collect their urine. But as soon as he'd pick the rat up, he basically would scream and drop the rat, and now you have rats running all over the research lab, and he's got rats running down the hallway, and people are chasing these research rats all over the place. And this is a daily occurrence. Now, Dr. Selye finally got smart, and he hired some students to do his research for him who weren't afraid of rats. And so they started collecting urine and blood samples. And they started to get really weird hormone levels. Super odd, super strange. Well, one of the nice things about Dr. Selye was he was smart enough to sit back and go, could the fact that we're chasing the rats down the hall have anything to do with these strange hormone levels? And he completely changed the focus of his research to what happens to your hormone levels when you get stressed out. And then, because those hormone levels he found changes, he wanted to know, what are those hormone levels doing to the body when they do change like that? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about stress and the fact that you perceive it in your mind, how it then affects the rest of the body. Changes your hormone levels, changes your neurological system, changes your health. And that's where it becomes really important, is that we know that stress affects your health. It was very interesting. About 10 years ago, a study was done looking at multiple patients in multiple different hospitals across the United States. And they were trying to kind of get to the bottom of why were these patients in this hospital? What happened to begin this progression of disease in their life so that they now had these fatal diseases that they were dying from? And one of the really interesting things was that 80% of these patients said that these diseases started due to stress in their lives. So that perhaps if we were able to reduce the stress in an individual's life and teach them how to control that stress, you might be able to cure 80% of the patients in your hospital and keep them from getting these horrible diseases. This is one of the reasons why you have kind of cutting-edge hospitals like Cedars-Sinai and Loma Linda, Johns Hopkins, where they're doing different things than they've done before. When your patient comes into the hospital, they're not just assigned a doctor or a team of nurses. Your patient is also assigned a therapist. So your doctor and your nursing staff go in to take care of the patient, and once they're done, a therapist goes in to take care of the patient. And once they're done, if the person requests it, so does their priest, their minister, whoever it might be, also goes in to take care of the patient. Because your patient is more than just a body. Your patient is all about the mind, the spiritual, all that stuff coming together affects the body. Your family affects you. So maybe you should have a family therapist talking to these patients whose family has driven them so crazy they're now sick. Things like that happen. Or you see patients who maybe they're long-term caretakers of someone who has been terminally ill. And that patient then becomes extremely ill because they're so busy taking care of somebody else that the stress in their lives have now made them very ill. Another very interesting study was done looking at people who they actually live a fairly stressful life, but they're not becoming ill from it. And these people basically said, we believe that we're not becoming ill because we don't look at stress as a bad thing in our life. We actually enjoy it, we're having a good time with it, we look at it as a positive stress and not a negative stress. And so a lot of this, of course, has to do with how you perceive the type of stress in your life, too. If you perceive this as a negative thing, or if you perceive this as something positive that you'll soon get over, and it'll be a good thing after that. Dr. Sellier came up with a definition of stress, and he said, there is a potential for stress when a situation is perceived as presenting a demand which threatens to exceed the person's capability and resources for meeting it. Now, this is a really important definition, especially with the word perceived. So science has basically said, yep, we agree with this definition because it's your perception that tells you if you're going to be stressed out or not. So for instance, you take a physiology class and you're trying to get a grade and move on with your career, and you perceive this as a stressful event. Now, if I happen to be sitting in the same physiology class with you, I wouldn't consider this class stressful at all. I wonder why. Well, it's because my perception's totally different. I could care less if I got an A or a B or a C in this class. As a matter of fact, the first time I took physiology, I got a C. I know you can get a C in a class and still make it to where you want to go in life, okay? So my perception is completely different than yours because I'm at a different point in life than you are. So our levels of stress are going to be all about perception. And of course, we know that perception has to do with our brain and what we're thinking. And so we're perceiving this stress. And of course, this is happening in the cerebral cortex. Now, by the way, we can have a perception of stress that is not a conscious perception. So something can be stressing you out and you don't necessarily know that it's stressing you out. You may not necessarily know why it's stressing you out. Allah, we have therapists who tell you all about that stuff, okay? But we can have these subconscious perceptions of stress, okay? So for instance, maybe you have these people who have this horrible fear of dogs. And they don't know why, they've never been bitten by a dog or anything, but then you observe that their father is also afraid of dogs. Well, they've probably been taught throughout their lifetime to be afraid of dogs, even though they have no idea why they are. So our perception of stress can be both conscious and subconscious. Now, when Dr. Sellier was talking about this general adaptation syndrome, he said there are 4 stages to this stress. And he kind of wrote them like this. And he said the first stage is what we would call the alarm stage of stress. The second stage of stress he called resistance. The third, exhaustion. And if you don't do anything about it, the final phase, stress can kill you. So we're going to go through these 4 stages of stress, and we're going to talk about what is physiologically happening in the body, what are the hormone changes that are occurring, how is this actually affecting the body. Now, before we do that, I also want to tell you one other thing. Dr. Sellier called this a syndrome. And anytime you see the word syndrome in the medical profession, what it typically means is that multiple different people can be affected with something, but their body will respond a different way. So for instance, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or what we know as the AIDS disease, okay? And if somebody gets that virus and they get this syndrome, they don't always have the same symptoms. Some people may end up with Kaposi sarcoma, which is a kind of cancer. Other people may end up with really bad herpes virus type of problems. Their bodies can respond very differently. Some patients have dementia, other patients don't. And it's the same thing with stress. Not all of us will have the same type of stress response. Some people get stressed out and they get a rash. Other people get stressed out, other things happen to them. Okay? And a lot of this, which we'll talk about, is really based on our genetics. How our body responds has a lot to do with our genetics. So you've probably seen this in people where certain families have certain types of problems that run through the family. So maybe certain families have heart attack issues, and other families have cancer issues. And it's the same type of thing with stress. Families usually respond to stress similarly. So let's talk about the alarm phase. So the alarm phase is a type of stress that we go through if all we have is just the alarm phase. We're not going to progress. We just go through the alarm phase and we're done with it. This is one of those kinds of stress that only lasts for a little while. So this might be a stress where you're walking down the hallway, it's dark, somebody jumps out and goes boo, and you get all excited and your heart rate goes up for a few seconds and then it's done. That was the alarm phase, done and over with. Now sometimes the alarm phase can last a little bit longer. It's still not very long, but maybe let's say, God forbid, you get into a car accident. Now you're not really very injured, but you're a little beat up and you're sore and you're stressed out because you just were in a car accident. It wasn't a lot of fun, it wasn't your fault, and maybe you're a little upset about this for a week or so. And it's stressing you out until you get the insurance check and you get to have another car, okay? Usually the alarm phase, we say, lasts for a couple seconds to a maximum of 2 weeks. So again, doesn't last very long. So maybe a couple seconds when somebody goes boo, or maybe a couple weeks while you're having to get your car fixed. During this time of the alarm phase, several different things are happening within the body. So the first thing that we see is when you perceive that there is a stress, that information is sent from the cerebral cortex to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus has to make a couple of decisions as to what it's going to be doing to stimulate the alarm phase, and it really does depend on how big of a stress you're going through. How big of a perception of stress is this? So if the hypothalamus perceives that this is just maybe a little teeny tiny stress, it's going to do one thing. If it perceives it's a different kind of stress, maybe this is going to last a bit longer, it's going to do something different. So we're going to start out just talking about the little teeny tiny stress. Maybe somebody just said boo, okay? And then we'll go into the little bit longer stress. They may last for 2 weeks or may last for 20 years, all right? So the first type of problem, once the hypothalamus figures out that this is just going to be a real short-term stress, it's going to be a very fast response because, when that person jumps out and goes boo, you go, okay, and you already have that response. It's very, very quick. This type of stress is going to be taken care of by stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system. Let's go over this just a tad so that we can understand what's going on. So we've been talking about neurons. And one of the things we talked about is once you stimulate a neuron, it's going to release a neurotransmitter. And typically neurons are talking to other neurons. They release that neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. It binds to the postsynaptic neuron, and off you go stimulating it again. However, not in the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system does release a neurotransmitter, but it doesn't stimulate a postsynaptic neuron. Instead, when the sympathetic nervous system releases a neurotransmitter, it stimulates some kind of organ. So maybe, let's say, it's going to stimulate the heart. There are receptors on the heart that bind this neurotransmitter. And when that neurotransmitter attaches to the receptors on the heart, it causes heart rate to go up. So with our sympathetic nervous system, we're releasing this neurotransmitter, but the neurotransmitter is binding to multiple different organs. Released from the sympathetic nervous system is called norepinephrine, or norepi. So even though it's binding to an organ, because it's being released from a neuron, we're still giving it the name a neurotransmitter. And so norepinephrine is released from the sympathetic nervous system. So norepinephrine is going to bind to these organs, and we refer to these as an effector organ because we get some kind of an effect, some kind of stress response going on. So if somebody were to jump out at you and say boo, can you tell me some of the things that might happen to your body?
Heart rate will go up.
Say it again?
Heart rate will be increased.
Okay, so you have an increase in heart rate. What else?
Respiration.
Okay, you have an increase in respiration. What else?
You'll flinch. Reflex.
Okay, we're going to call that muscle contraction. So you have increased muscle contraction. Because it really actually kind of depends on your training. Some people will flinch, some people will punch. You got to be careful saying boo to people, okay? You don't know what their training has been. All right, what else?
Pupils dilate.
Say it again?
Pupils dilate.
Pupils dilate. So I can see their face better to punch it. What else? Come on, you've been scared before. What else happens to you?
What?
You sweat. Okay, so we'll say increased perspiration. You ever given a speech and been afraid or stressed out? Your tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth. That's going to be decreased salivation. Now, you're probably not thinking about this while you're being stressed out, but you actually have a decrease in your immune response. Another thing I'm pretty sure you're not thinking about after somebody just said boo, but you actually also have a decrease in your reproductive response. So sexual thoughts are not going through your mind at that moment. Anything else you can think of?
Getting angry.
Okay, you could. Now, it depends on the person. Again, it has a lot to do with training. So you might see somebody get angry. You might see somebody go to tears. Okay, kind of depends on the training. So we'll just say an increase in emotions.
Decrease appetite.
Decrease appetite? Now, of course, this depends on the amount of stress and how long the stress is going to be with you. Because if you have somebody who is under tons and tons of stress for a long period of time, you might have an increased appetite. Okay? We'll talk about why that appetite changes depending on what kind of stress it is later. But originally, when we're just saying boo, you're definitely not thinking about going and getting a bag of chips. Okay? Typically, at that moment, there's a decreased appetite. Here's one of my favorites. Relaxation of sphincters. Could end up peeing your pants or vomiting or worse. All kinds of body fluids could be coming out. Which, by the way, is also one of the reasons why when people are under a lot of stress, they have a lot of heartburn issues. Because that sphincter that holds the stomach shut relaxes. And all that acid starts refluxing up the esophagus. So this becomes an issue. So we medicate our patients, but we don't say, hey, have you been under a lot of stress? This could be causing your problem. Now, all these things are happening when somebody jumps out and says boo, and that's because norepinephrine is binding to all these different effector organs and creating these responses. So norepinephrine is binding to the pupils and making them dilate, binding to muscles and making them contract, binding in the brain and changing emotional responses, binding to those sphincters and making them relax. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter doing all this stuff. And remember, this is all happening in just a few seconds. And this is why we're using the neurological system to get this response, because our neurons can transport information from one area of the body to another in a matter of milliseconds. So imagine how fast it takes you to think, I want to wiggle my toe, before you actually are wiggling your toe. You're still thinking it while it's wiggling. Okay? So we have this very rapid response. So when that person jumps out and says, boo, we get this rapid neurological information movement through the body. Any questions about this? Okay, so the next thing is, what if it's going to be, I'm in that car accident and I'm going to have to recuperate and I'm stressed out for the next, let's say, 2 weeks. How is my body going to be different? What's it going to be doing hormonally, neurologically? And by the way, why? Why in the world do we have this frigging stress response? Because especially after boo, it's not a lot of fun to be under this stress. Why do we have it? Well, you know, if you kind of think back to where we all came from and living on the open prairies and in caves and there's lions everywhere and you don't have a house with a gun, okay? Stress was a little higher back then. And it was a little bit more demanding on the body. You needed to be able to have all that muscle contraction to fight off whatever was trying to kill you, or hopefully to be able to run away from it. That stress response was there to save your life. Problem is, we still have the stress response, but we don't need it to save our lives. And instead what happens is we have this massive amount of stress in our society today that we deal with every single day. Back then it was either the lion ate you or you survived. And when you survived, it was like, okay, stress is gone for today. If you didn't survive, well, stress is gone today too, okay? But it was there and it was gone and you didn't have to stress out. But now you've got to stress out all the way to work because there's all those idiots on the road, and you've got to stress out while you're here because, well, you're at school and it's a stressful situation. And then you go home and you have to work and take care of family and do all that stuff, and it's stressful. And when do you ever have a moment to go, whew, okay, I escaped that lion today? And we don't really have that as much anymore. So we're living under this constant bombardment of stress chemicals that are making our body react as if we're running away from lions all the time, every single day. Yes?
Now, a lion attacking you is more immediate versus something that's pending, like some sort of anxiety.
Right?
The same type of stress, though?
It is the same type of stress. It's the exact same stress response, only magnified. Which is where we're going to go now. We're going to talk about what happens if my stress response lasts longer than just a lion chasing me. Okay? What's going to happen if now I am going to be super stressed out because, well, I was in that car accident. So it's going to be 2 weeks worth of stress now. Okay? I have the fast response. This does occur. Because I got in that car accident, I'm going to have the fast response. But then my brain goes, okay, well, this isn't over after a couple of seconds. So now we're going to have to do a couple different things. So one of the other things that happens when the stress is going to last longer is the sympathetic nervous system is going to now talk to my adrenal glands. So if you remember, the adrenal glands sit right here above the kidneys. And the adrenal glands have a cortex, and then they have a medulla. So they have that outside and the inside part. The sympathetic nervous system is going to release norepinephrine, and it's going to bind to the adrenal medulla. Okay? So you're going to have something like this. You redraw this, and instead of having a heart here, we'll have an adrenal gland. So I have a cortex of my adrenal gland. I also have a medulla. And this time, my receptors are going to be all the way down into the medulla. So my norepinephrine is binding to the adrenal medulla.
This is still under alarm.
Yes. So this phase that's happening here is going to occur because stress is going to last for more than 2 seconds. Literally for more than 2 seconds. It could be 2 weeks, it could be 20 years. And so if the brain decides this is going to last for more than 2 seconds, it tells the adrenal, or it tells the sympathetic nervous system, release more epinephrine, have it bind to the adrenal medulla. Now, when we have norepinephrine binding to the adrenal medulla, the medulla releases 2 separate hormones. Now, what's the definition of a hormone again? Has to travel through your bloodstream. It's released from a gland, we got that, the adrenal gland, and it has to travel through your bloodstream, go from point A to point B, okay? So the first hormone that's released, that gets into the bloodstream, is a hormone called epinephrine. Now, you guys probably have heard of this more often as adrenaline. Now, in the United States, if you're talking to your friends, you'll probably use the term adrenaline. Oh man, I was so scared my adrenaline went up. Okay, but if you're working in a hospital, you're going to call it epinephrine. In the medical profession in the United States, actually in the medical profession around the world, except England, they're weird, everybody calls it epinephrine. England still calls it adrenaline in the hospitals. But when the doctor asks you for epinephrine, okay, he's asking you for adrenaline. Okay? So epinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla. Now look at what other hormone it makes. And this is where students get confused. It also makes norepinephrine. This is the same chemical we've been talking about that is released from the sympathetic nervous system as a neurotransmitter. But now, this same chemical is being released from a gland. It's going into the bloodstream. It's the same chemical, but we're going to call it a hormone. So if it comes from a neuron, it's a neurotransmitter. If it comes from a gland and gets into the bloodstream, it's a hormone. Okay? But it's still the same chemical. As a matter of fact, epinephrine and norepinephrine are really, really similar in chemical structure. There's only one carbon difference between the two. Norepinephrine has one less carbon. These guys are basically going to do the same identical thing to our body that this neurotransmitter did. So the whole idea is we want to release these two hormones because hormones are more potent, they're more powerful, they last longer than neurotransmitters. Now we have epinephrine and norepinephrine floating around in the bloodstream, and they will give us a bigger, longer stress response. Help us to cope with the stress that's going on around us. Now here's the interesting thing before I let you take a break. If we were to remove, and unfortunately doctors have done this by accident because they didn't know any better way back when, but if we were to remove somebody's adrenal gland, okay, we have multiple different hormones, and we'll talk about more when we come back from break. We have multiple different hormones that help us with the stress response. And they come from the adrenal gland. And when the doctors removed the person's adrenal gland, when that person was even slightly stressed, they died immediately. So although it doesn't seem like increasing heart rate, increasing respiration, all these effects are actually good for us, these are coping mechanisms that help us to get through stress. And without these hormones, without this ability, stress would kill you in a matter of minutes. All right, let's get started again. We are going to finish up talking about the alarm phase. And so far we've talked about the fact that the first part is the sympathetic nervous system is now going to be told to stimulate the adrenal medulla. And we're going to release the two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what those two are going to do is give us a bigger response that allows it to last for a longer period of time. Because neurotransmitters only come in very tiny amounts, and they don't last very long. So when norepinephrine is released as a neurotransmitter, all these effects don't last for very long. But when it's released as a hormone, the effects are greater, they can last for longer periods of time. Okay? Now, we have one other thing happening at the same time the sympathetic nervous system is stimulating the adrenal medulla. Okay? At the same time, we start to see that the hypothalamus is also going to release a hormone. Okay, so this hormone that comes from the hypothalamus is called corticotropin releasing hormone, also known as So as our adrenal medulla is stimulated, the hypothalamus is releasing CRH at the same time. Releases CRH, that hormone is going to get into the bloodstream, and it's then going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary is going to release the hormone adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as ACTH. Great words for your spelling books. ACTH is also then going to get into the bloodstream, and it's going to then also stimulate the adrenal glands. However, this time it's going to be the adrenal cortex. And it's going to secrete a hormone called cortisol. Now, out of all these hormones, this is our only steroid hormone. ACTH, CRH, epinephrine, norepinephrine, none of those are steroid hormones, just cortisol. Cortisol gets into the bloodstream and stimulates the liver. The cells of the liver are going to go through a process called glycogenolysis. And glycogenolysis means we're going to break down the glycogen that's normally stored in the liver, and we're going to break it down into glucose molecules. And you know, if we have a bunch of glucose, we can make a whole bunch more ATP. So this whole process of CRH to ACTH to cortisol, really, its main function is to increase ATP production in the stress response. Why do you think we need so much more ATP when we're stressed out?
If we're getting chased by a lion and we have to run.
Perfect! In case we get chased by that lion and you've got to run away. Your muscles are tensing. If you've got to get into that fight or into that flight, you're going to have plenty of ATP going on. All these effects that we talk about, increased perspiration, increased heart rate, all these things, they're going to require more ATP production. Now, one other thing for you to know is epinephrine can also help us with ATP production. So when epinephrine goes up, what it's able to do is go through a process in our body called gluconeogenesis. This is where we take fats and proteins and they're converted increases ATP production. This is also one of the reasons why when a person is stressed out, quite often appetite goes up for sugary things or carbohydrate-like substances because the body is telling you you're under stress, I need more ATP, so please eat more carbohydrates because they'll provide me with quick ATP energy.
Lies.
Exactly.
But now it makes sense.
It's true for the moment, but can cause long-term damage.
So why do they say like working out decreases your stress?
Hang in there, keep that question. I will definitely answer that, but I want to get through a couple other things before I can answer that well. Don't let me forget it though. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so now by the way, this is all happening in the alarm phase. Our first portion here is the only thing that happens if we're only in stress for a couple of seconds. If we're going to be in stress for longer, everything then kicks in to our stress response. Now if, let's say, we're going to be under stress for more than a couple of weeks, and it's kind of interesting because if you read a lot about the stress that people go under, most of the stress response or the stress issues that we have in our life, they last for about 2 weeks. If you can get through the 2 weeks of stress, you're probably going to be okay after that till like the next issue comes up. Unless, of course, you're like a crazy college student. And then you get to be stressed for, I don't know, 2, 4, 6, 10, God only knows how many years you get to be under the stress response. And then you get to go in the medical field and be under the stress response for the rest of your life. Yay, okay? Which now means if you're under stress for more than a couple of weeks, you're going to move into what we call the resistance phase in our general adaptation syndrome. Now the first thing I want you to know is in the resistance phase, all these things we've been talking about are still happening because you're still under stress. You're releasing epi, norepi, cortisol, all these hormones are still occurring. Now before we go into resistance, I also want to just confuse you a little bit more. Even if I'm not under terrible stress, okay? Even if I'm living a fairly not stressed out life, okay? My life is fairly peaceful. I still will make some epi, some norepi, some cortisol, okay? Because just breathing is considered like a stress for the body. So the body always has a little bit of those hormones floating around at all times. It's just the more stressed out we are, the more of those hormones we have. And cortisol especially, it does a lot of other things for the body. It helps to regulate blood pressure, helps to regulate your immune system. You've probably heard of cortisol by things like hydrocortisone or hydrocortisone creams, things like that. Cortisol is an anti-inflammatory also, so it helps with our immune system. If we have inflammation, cortisol levels will rise a little bit, help to take down inflammation. That's why if you put cortisol on something that's all swollen, it helps to take down that inflammation. So it does a lot of good things for the body. It's just it starts to go up in the stress response to help us to handle the stress that we're under, okay? Just so that you know, they're there at all times, but they don't cause all these things to go on unless they're in high concentrations. Now, imagine if you are a person who is in college, probably not hard for you to imagine, and now you're going to be in college for the next 3-5 years, and you're going to be under stress, okay? Good old community college students are usually under more stress because you have so many things you have to do with your life all at one time. And so now this stress response is going constantly. Your heart rate is up, your respiration's up. Oh, I didn't put this one in there. You have an increase in blood pressure, okay? That's also something that's going on. Your muscles are all constricted because you're ready to fight or flight, and your pupils are dilated. Do these things sound like stuff that you should allow to happen year after year after year after year in somebody's life? No, No, not a good thing. You don't want high blood pressure, high heart rate, high respiration. This is bad. So during the resistance phase, what our body is going to attempt to do is to say, okay, I get it, you're under stress, but all these effects are bad for this body. So I want to try to do something to make the effects go down. You're not going to relax, you're not going to take a vacation, you're not going to drop out of school, so let's try to get the effects to go down some other way. Can you think of any other way? If I can't turn off the sympathetic nervous system, if I can't get the hormones to go down, is there some other way to make the effects go down, not as bad as what they typically are?
Amnesia.
Amnesia. Okay, yes. Say it again. Downregulate. Now my body can't make me kickbox. Yeah, but it's got to do something else. So what the body's going to do is downregulation. So during the resistance phase, we're going to see downregulation occur. What's downregulation again?
Receptors go in the cell.
The receptors go inside the cell. And what does that do for me?
Blocks all the stress hormones.
Yeah, if my hormones can't bind to those receptors because they're inside the cell, can my cell respond? No. It doesn't have the ability to respond. So even though I have super high hormone levels, the majority of my receptors go inside the cell, and my stress response doesn't feel as great. My body doesn't have as high of a heart rate, as high of blood pressure. Now, by the way, downregulation isn't perfect. So usually blood pressure might be a little bit high. Heart rate might be a little bit high, okay? Maybe instead of 80 beats per minute, it's now 90 beats per minute, okay? But it's better. It's not 120 beats per minute. And things are a little bit better. My immune response might not be as low. But I do have one big issue here, and that is this hormone here, cortisol. Because cortisol is a steroid. And you can't downregulate against steroid hormones. Why? What happens that prevents us from downregulating? What's the difference with a steroid hormone versus, let's say, a protein hormone? Exactly. Steroids are made out of fat, and they dissolve right through the cell membrane, right into the nucleus of the cell, and they hit the DNA personally. Cortisol, just like cyclic AMP, can bind to our DNA and start protein transcription translation things going on. Cortisol can make the cell respond, and the cell has no defense against it. So we have some problems long-term if I have long-term stress and my cortisol levels are constantly high and I can't downregulate against it. So let's list a few of the problems due to high cortisol levels. One of the things about cortisol, it is a catabolic hormone. And that's what it is in high concentrations or low concentrations. Cortisol is able to break things down. That's what it does. So now imagine if I have this hormone in high concentrations for long periods of time. It starts to break things down in my body that really shouldn't be broken down, like it breaks down muscle. If I'm super stressed out, one of the issues is I start to lose muscle mass. And that could also be cardiac muscle, by the way. And I have an increased risk of heart failure or heart attack. Not good. By the way, people who are really, really super stressed out, cortisol will also decrease fat content by breaking fat down in their body as well. And you see people who are stressed out, long-term, high levels of stress, And they're usually these skinny, teeny skeletons, no muscle mass, no fat content. They kind of look like concentration camp victims. It's not a good situation. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why concentration camp victims look like they do. Because they have such high cortisol levels. And they lose all their fat content. Another issue is high cortisol levels become an immunosuppressant. Is suppressant 2 P's? I think it is. No, 1 P. Is that right? The 2 P's and 1 S or 2? I don't remember. Look it up. Who cares? It's an immunosuppressant. It's 2 P's and 2 S's. There you go, just fool me. Does that just happen to me, or does that happen to you too? You spell all your life and all of a sudden you forget how to spell it?
Simple words sometimes.
Especially at this time of the morning.
I drank all my coffee. And you might have had this issue with cortisol in your life already, being a college student. So has this ever happened to you? You know, you get towards the end of the semester, all those crazy teachers keep packing on more and more and more projects for you to get done right at the end of the semester, and your stress levels are going up and up and up and up. And then, whew, the semester's finally over, and then you're sick. And you get to be sick like for the whole Christmas vacation, get healthy just in time to come back for winter quarter, and they do it to you all over again. Dang teachers. But that's because when all those projects were piling up and all those finals were being done, you were super stressed out and your cortisol levels go up and your immune system plummets. And then some snot-nosed kid sneezes on you and boom, you get sick. Now imagine people who are under long-term stress for long periods of time. There's all kinds of issues that can occur. So for instance, stress can cause cancer. That's absolutely a potential possibility right there. Because we go through about, between 50 and 100,000 rounds of mitosis per minute in our body. And every 10,000 times we go through mitosis, one of those cells mutate and become a cancer cell. Now for a healthy person, that's no big deal because you've got immune cells, little phagocytes floating around that eat up those cancer cells all day long. But now imagine if you have somebody who's immunosuppressed. What's going to happen with long-term stress? Their risk of cancer goes up. Also, we talked about the fact that cortisol can go in and affect the DNA. Well, one of the other things that cortisol can do in high concentrations is it can mutate your own DNA. And it can do things like turn on parts of your DNA that should not be turned on and turn off parts of your DNA that should be turned on. And all of a sudden, now you have an autoimmune disease because you turned on that genetics in your DNA that was never on before. So there's a bunch of different things as far as the immune system is concerned that cortisol is able to screw up if we have the cortisol in too high of concentrations.
So when you draw your labs, they look at your cortisol levels?
Absolutely not.
No?
No. Cortisol costs a lot of money, and doctors don't want to look at those levels. If you request the doctor to look at your cortisol levels, they'll probably laugh at you.
That's great.
Yeah.
So
Yes, it
stress
is.
alone can give you a heart attack too, because you're talking about the muscle, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Now, also, you don't ever have your cortisol levels taken with a blood test. If a doctor takes your cortisol levels with a blood test, kindly explain to them that that's a bad idea. Of course, they'll probably divorce you as a client then, but it's a very bad idea because cortisol goes up with stress. So the minute you get that pinprick, your cortisol levels go up. And so now you have artificially high levels. So you have to take, the best way to take cortisol is to spit in a vial. That's the best way to test cortisol. So you get a little vial, you spit in it, and you can test it that way. Although you can also do a urine test for cortisol. Not quite as accurate, but not too bad. But blood tests of cortisol, very, very inaccurate. Unless, of course, they have an IV and they just put an IV in and take it the next day, which sometimes they do if you're in the hospitals. Okay, so another issue with cortisol. It changes our circadian rhythms. Now, circadian rhythms is basically your sleep-wake cycle. And scientists have done a lot of studies on this, and the human body is on a 24-hour cycle. Surprise, surprise. And that means if I were to put you in a room that was completely dark, you would still stay awake and go to sleep for about the same amount of hours. Maybe not the same hours of the day, but you would still sleep for just about the same amount of hours and be awake for about the same amount of hours, whether you knew if it was day or night, just because our brain and our body is on a rhythm. However, with super high cortisol levels, it can change that rhythm. So let me give you an example of this change, and maybe you can see if your cortisol levels are high, and you don't even have to have the doctor take a test. So here's your test. Does this ever happen to you? Do you ever go to bed, let's say at nighttime, and you're nice and tired? So it's 10, 11, 11:30, 12, whatever time you go to bed. You're tired, you want to go to bed, you want to go to sleep, you get in bed, and you can't go to sleep. And you can't sleep because the world is like racing through your mind, and you're thinking about all this stuff, and it takes you like 45 minutes to an hour to finally get to sleep.
If I'm lucky.
But when you do get to sleep, you're doing pretty good. You're sleeping pretty well. And then, somewhere about 2:30, 3:30 in the morning, bink, you're wide awake. And it's not because the dogs are barking or some car went by. Nothing happened. There's no reason for you to be awake, but you are. And you're sitting there going, I should get up and do something, but really you're too tired to get up and do something, but you can't go to sleep, and so you're just kind of tossing and turning, and it might take you another hour or hour and a half now to get back to sleep, and finally it's like 6 o'clock in the morning and your alarm goes off at, let's say, 6:30, and then you're up and now you're exhausted, which of course is a stress. So your cortisol levels go up again. If you're experiencing anything like that, you are definitely in the resistance phase of stress. And your cortisol levels are definitely up. Woo-hoo. Bet you wanted to know that. All right. Any questions so far about cortisol?
Many.
Okay, one more. This is the one I know college students love the most. Cortisol decreases your ability to store and or retrieve short-term memory. So think about studying for that exam. And you are studying, and it just is not sticking. No matter how hard you study, it's just not sticking. That's because cortisol blocks the area of your brain that allows you to stick that information into your short-term memory. That area is the hippocampus and the amygdala. And cortisol can literally block storage. So no matter how hard you study, if you are super stressed out, it is just not going to stick. Or maybe while you're studying, you're okay. Like you're at home, you're studying, you're not quite as stressed out while you're at home, and so it's sticking. And you know the stuff. And then you walk into the physiology classroom, you just see my face and your stress levels go up, sky high. Here's what cortisol now does, is it locks the door on your short-term memory and will not allow you to retrieve all that stuff you just stuck in there. You can't remember it. And you're sitting there going, holy crap, I studied this essay, I can't remember anything. You have no idea how many times I get that at the end of an essay. I'm sorry, Dr. Harvey, I just cannot remember this. But I do know when you do remember it, you put that test on my desk and you walk out the door and bam! The closet to your short-term memory is now unlocked because cortisol levels, poof, just went down. So what you have to try to figure out is how do I stay calmer in the middle of all of this stress while I'm taking this test, because if I don't, all that studying was for nothing. I'm not going to be able to retrieve all the information I know I have. You've got to figure out for yourself how to do this. Now, one of the things that I suggest to students, and of course not all teachers will allow you to do this, is you have to understand what's called state studying. So if you're at home and you're studying and you feel pretty relaxed and everything's cool, you're in a certain state of mind. And that state of mind would be less stress and the studying is sticking and you're doing okay. Then when you come into class, you're in a different state of mind. And it's a state of mind where your cortisol levels are too high and you're not able to retrieve that information. So somehow you've got to bring that state of mind from home into the classroom. And they've done some psychological studies to say, if you're at home studying, if you could study with something in front of you, and whatever that something is, you could bring that to the classroom, it could potentially help you to recall and to feel the state of mind you had at home in the classroom and lower your cortisol levels. So for instance, if you study at home and you eat while you study, then bring food into the classroom and eat while you take the exam. It could help you lower your cortisol levels and help you to remember better.
You okay if I take off my shoes?
Yes, as long as they don't stink, I'm fine with that. Or you don't write the answers inside your shoe, I'm cool with that. If you study, like I had a student who, he had like a little baby Gru on his desk at home, so he brought that with him to school to try to see if it would bring him that same thing when he stared at it. Or I've had students who they've got a picture of their kid where they study at home, so they brought the picture to class with them.
You notice a consistent difference with this, like from their first test?
Yes, they're much happier. I see a lot more smiles, which would mean that they are feeling less stressed so that their grades go up. And there's usually a consistent increase in grades with students who will bring things in. The guy who had the baby Gru, as soon as he brought that in, he got an A on every single exam. Now, I'm not saying baby Gru will get you an A. Okay? That's not what I'm saying. You don't know what Gru is? No.
Gru, the dad that adopts the daughters.
The dad, he had a little, not Groot, that's the tree. He had a little Gru. Because he thought he was a funny guy. He liked the movies, so he brought that in. I know. I'm not saying that's for you. I'm saying that's for him, okay? I'm not saying it's for you. I'm saying whatever is for you, that's what, and obviously Gru is not for you. You should get the movies, though. You might like them, okay? But maybe you would do better with the baby Groot. That might be for you. But you see what I'm saying is what they're doing is they're trying to bring something in to help to calm them down, to change their state of mind. And our state of mind is going to affect our memory. Okay?
So is that what affected the hippocampus too? Like I heard with the Kavanaugh case with the woman that her hippocampus was affected for when they don't remember stuff from short-term memory from years ago though? Or is it the long-term memory is also affected?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So, anything that we do, experience, learn for the most part, except for a few weird things. For the most part, it has to go into our short-term memory first. Typically stays there for a couple of years before the brain decides, should I put that in long-term memory or shouldn't I? And then if the brain thinks it's a good thing for you to remember long-term, that memory will go into long-term memory. But everything, again, except for a few weird things, will go through short-term to long-term. So if I can't remember something, it's usually one of two things. Number one, it was such a stressful event that my brain totally blocked it out, and it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to be able to remember it because it's not in my brain to remember anymore. My brain just blocked it out, we're done. It's not there. You won't be able to get me to recall it because I don't have it in my brain. The other thing it could be is that the brain took it into short-term memory and then decided, no, this is too horrendous. We don't want this in our long-term memory, so it's gone. And then, of course, the third thing, as you well know, things can go into your long-term memory, but you forget them after a while. The brain doesn't think that they're all so important. There's certain things the brain thinks is frigging important, and sometimes they're the weirdest things. Like, I don't know why, but I can remember my childhood telephone number. Who cares about your childhood telephone number? But my brain, for some reason, thinks that that telephone number is uber important, and it is still stuck in my brain. There's a lot of things I wish I could remember, and the brain goes, nah, it wasn't that important. But this phone number, oh, heck yeah, that's important. It'll save your life one of these days, okay? I don't get it. Our brains are weird, okay? So, yes, it could be it was never there to begin with, so she can't really recall it. It could be it was maybe partially stored. It could be that it was stored, but she's forgotten it because it's a long time ago. It could be she's lying.
Yeah, you don't. That's what I thought.
And the problem is you don't know.
You don't.
Now, this is a really good question. Of course, it's very applicable to us today. But it used to be if people came into court and said, I think I have these memories, you could then take that person to a hypnotist and try to bring out the memories. Problem with that is that if you go into hypnosis, there is one slight issue that could happen. And what could happen is if the hypnotist doesn't really know their stuff very well, they could make suggestions that your brain starts to build pictures of, and when you come out of hypnosis, nobody is going to get you to believe that those things did not actually happen. Like I'll give you, for instance, this is when the Supreme Court said no hypnosis is ever allowed. There was a young girl who, she was in her 20s at the time, and she had gone to hypnosis because when she was younger, she was with her best friend, and her best friend was kidnapped and later killed. And she could not remember what happened. Now, of course, that's got to really affect you through your life, that you're the only person who is a witness to this, you think, and you can't remember what happened to your friend. So she went to hypnosis. And under hypnosis, a suggestion was made that her father did it. So when she came out of hypnosis, she remembered exactly what happened, vividly, probably too vividly for something she could never remember before that happened like 10 years prior. She said her father had picked them up in the van, she watched her father rape and torture her friend, she watched her father kill her friend, she even knew where her friend was buried. So they took the father to court, they prosecuted him, and he was convicted. Well, the whole time, which was kind of weird in my opinion, is that the police never took the young lady to where she said her friend was buried. They never looked for the body. So after the father had been convicted, he was in jail for 5 years, somebody goes, oh, maybe we should go look for the body. Okay, duh. And so she took them, and she was adamant, she is here. There was absolutely no trace that a human being had ever been buried there. No trace at all. And let me tell you, they can tell if there were burials hundreds of years ago. They have the equipment that can do that, and there was no trace that a human had ever been buried in that spot. So now that made her story completely wrong. And they let the father out of jail, and based on this evidence, and based on the fact that she had gone through hypnosis, and the Supreme Court said, we will not allow hypnosis information into court. So this is one of the other reasons why the Supreme Court and the senators and everybody had to say we can't base this information on your memories whether they're true or not. It's not even legal for them to do this, okay? And so a lot of times, and you probably have experienced this in your life, you probably have memories that you think something happened maybe while you were a kid and your parents goes, no, that did not happen that way, okay? But that's because you saw it from your perspective as a young person and somebody else saw it completely differently. And so our memories can be faulty too.
Wouldn't that, because I know it's called dissociation, but wouldn't that be like another phase of exhaustion?
Yes, yes, it can be. Yes, absolutely. Okay, last part. We're going to talk about the exhaustion phase. And you do notice the picture I have up there. That's just for y'all, so you can understand the non-stressed out types of job that you're going into and how relaxing it should be for you in that job. Do you realize that 1 in 2 people who finish their nursing that was totally Freudian, right? Their nursing school and then take their NCLEX will not become a nurse? 1 in 2. All that work and they don't become a nurse because it's too stressful. Used to be when I first started working, it was 1 in 7 would drop out. Then it went to 1 in 5. Now it's 1 in 2.
What are those teachers doing to us? You're just wasting your time.
It's a stressful job. It's very, very difficult, and I think the biggest stress is on your emotions. That's the biggest stress, is having to deal with people dying, having to deal with people that you can't help, having to deal with people that you know could be helped, but the insurance won't pay for it to be helped. There's just all kinds of different things. And,
dealing with other nurses as a nurse.
Dealing with other nurses, yes,
Doctors.
but you know what? You have to deal with your bosses and your coworkers in any job. But your job has that added benefit of people die on you and things are hard. I have a student who she works in the pediatric oncology ward at Loma Linda. I don't think there's a harder ward to work in. If you're in oncology, you have patients who die every single day. It's just to be expected. You're going to go in one day and that little kid that you just started to fall in love with is going to be dead. And her stress levels were super high and she had to figure out, how do I deal with this because I want to keep doing this job. And so one of the things that she did is she stopped all social media. No Facebook, no Instagram, nothing. She totally took herself off social media because one of the things that was super stressful for her was the patient wasn't ever out of her life. So she couldn't go on to the next patient and deal with the next patient because the families wanted to keep commiserating with her. And she's just like, I understand why they want to do that, but for me, I can't do my job because they're not seeing the next patient and the next patient die. And so I have to move on. And so that was one of her ways to remedy at least a little bit of stress so that when she got home, she could just be free of all of that for a few hours before she went back. And so being a nurse is a lot of stress. It is very, very difficult to deal with. You can see I'm not one. Not going to happen. My mother was a nurse for 52 years, and I saw what she went through, and there's absolutely no way. I did not want to have to deal with that. Although my mother's a very weird person. She loves everybody, and everybody loves her. And she has some very interesting coping mechanisms for stress. And so you don't see a lot of nurses who make it for 50-some years. So you just have to find your best coping mechanism so that you can make it for all those years and be really happy in your job. So in the exhaustion phase, what's happening here is a person has been under stress for usually quite a number of years. However, let me also tell you that it also depends on how much stress. You can go through alarm, resistance, and into exhaustion very quickly. So let me just back it up a little bit and I'll tell you how somebody passes from resistance into exhaustion. So one of the things that scientists and doctors have seen for a long time is you have these patients who come in and they start complaining about things that are going wrong with them. They're not feeling good, that kind of thing. So maybe you have this patient who comes in and they're complaining, oh man, I have this stomach trouble, my stomach hurts, and I just kind of don't feel good. And it's not all the time, it's not every day, it's just kind of once in a while, but it's just really bothering me. And tests are run, and maybe you think it's an ulcer or something else, and nothing. Can't find anything wrong with them. Or then you have another patient who comes in and says, oh man, my heart giving me some problems. I feel like fluttering, like butterflies in my chest all the time, and I'm just not really sure. So you do some EKGs, maybe some blood work. Nothing. Have another patient who comes in and says, oh, I have these headaches, and I just don't know what's going on, and I don't know what the problem is, what the issue is. And so you run tests, you can find nothing. What's happening is the person is in the resistance phase, and things are starting to go wrong, and they feel it, but it's not that wrong yet. They haven't developed an ulcer. They haven't developed into migraines. They haven't had a heart attack. You don't have the clinical capability of diagnosing them. Our clinical studies are not sensitive enough to say, well, it looks like you're going into developing an ulcer. Or it looks like you're going to eventually, if you keep going, experience a heart attack. Or develop into migraines or whatever it may be. We don't have the clinical ability to do that. We're not Star Trek yet. Okay? But eventually, because the person doesn't stop the stress in their lives, they don't change their lifestyle, they're not eating well, they're not exercising, they're not sleeping well, they're really stressed out, they're going to cross a line one of these days. Because they've got that high cortisol level breaking things down. And when they cross that line, they're going to have that ulcer. Or they're going to have that heart attack. And they're going to come into you, and you're going to be able to clinically diagnose them now. We say that they've crossed the line between resistance and exhaustion when they do actually become clinically diagnosable. They might have been complaining for a long time, but they didn't actually have a heart attack. And of course, during this complaining time when they come in, this is one of the things that you need to ask them about. How's the stress in your life? They'll probably say, fine, I've got plenty of it, no problem. Okay? And this is where you try to help them with that issue. So, to go into the exhaustion phase, your patient is now sick. There's now something wrong with them. Now, also remember, we're talking about they might have an ulcer, they might have a heart attack, they might have headaches, they might have an autoimmune disease, but they could also have mood disorders. And one of the problems with medicine is we don't see this as an illness, and it is. Because what we usually do for some odd reason is we separate the head from the rest of the body and say the head is different from the rest of the body. That is absolutely not true. The head is part of the body. And people who have disorders in the brain have disorders because something's wrong physiologically in their brain. They don't choose to have a mood disorder. It happens to them because of issues in life, and some of those issues are changes in cortisol levels, changes in epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're actual physical diseases, just like having a heart attack. So think about the fact, that a lot of doctors will say, oh yeah, it's all in their head. And your answer to that should say, well, no kidding. Okay? The head is part of the body, and look, this stress response is all started off and controlled by the head, okay? And that head, that brain, started this whole cascade of hormonal changes. So it's not unusual for people who are under a lot of stress to then have mood disorders, or what we would call dysphoria. It happens. And some of this is actually a protective mechanism by the brain. So think about a person whose brain becomes depressed. What does depressed actually mean? Well, it means to slow things down or to push things down, to depress something. Why would your brain want to slow a person down who's under a lot of stress? Why would this be a helpful mechanism to the body?
Because everything is increased.
Yeah, maybe they're working too much. They're overloaded. Think about what a person who's depressed wants to do. Well, one thing is they want to sleep. That's very healing, by the way. Sleep is a good thing because usually people who are super stressed out can't sleep. And they haven't been able to sleep for years, and all of a sudden the brain goes, okay, you know what? We need to sleep, and we need to sleep a lot. And so this can be a very good healing mechanism. They also don't want to be around people. People stress you out. So if you can get away from people, a lot of people who are depressed just want to go outside, sit on a bench, and leave me alone. I just want it to be quiet for a while. That's a really good healing mechanism. Sometimes being depressed, if you just sort of go with it for a bit, can actually be very healing to the body. One of the problems is, though, we look at depression as, oh, this is terrible, we need to snap them out of it right away. Well, not necessarily. Maybe give the person a little bit of time to rest and a little bit of time to heal so that they can get themselves back on their feet. So sometimes the brain really does know what it's doing and helps that person. But we're all into happy, happy, happy. We've got to be so happy, and we have to pretend to be happy all the time. And being depressed is just so horrifying that we think people are like crazy if you are a little bit sad or a little bit moody or a little bit irritable. Okay? That's just what a nurse is. Sad, moody, and irritable. Okay? Because they have to be around people so frigging much. And maybe all those ultraviolet lights, they don't help you either in those hospitals. So get outside and sit on a bench. Go eat your lunch outside. Get from underneath those lights. They'll drive you crazy after a while. So just keep in mind that sometimes the mood disorders that we get are really because we're tired and we're working too much and we're too stressed, and this is a healing mechanism for the brain. Now, of course, sometimes it will go on too long, and so what are we going to do for our patients who have these mood disorders that just keep going and going and going?
They give them SSRIs.
Well, we'll give them drugs, won't we? Because that's what we do in the medical field. We give a drug. How well are they helping? Not really. They're not doing a heck of a lot of good for people as far as the long term. Now, maybe short term, they're going to maybe help snap them out a little bit, help them with their thought processes, because one of the problems with a mood disorder and becoming depressed is the brain also has a tendency to slow down. And what that means is it doesn't release as many neurotransmitters as it used to because it's tired. Okay? And so it starts to slow down. And giving them something like an SSRI or some other type of drug that helps to speed up neurotransmitters will help the patient a bit with their thought processes. Okay? It does help them with that. Enough that they can then do what? Go back to their stressed out life? Because usually that's what they do, right? You have this person who is sick. This is kind of like you give them a sugar cookie and you tell them, don't worry about your cancer, just go back to your stressed out life. You're not really doing any different for them. You just gave them a sugar pill and told them that they can be happy artificially and they can still live the life that they live. How well is that going to heal their brain?
It's keeping them out of homeostasis. Like you said, if they go depressed from stress, you're balancing back out, right?
That's right.
So the meds are keeping them...
I'm giving them a drug, and I'm making them happy with the drug, hopefully, and then I'm sending them right back into their lifestyle. I might as well just tell them to go take some cocaine and go on their way, because the cocaine will make them happy too. I'm really doing the same thing, and that's what we do in the medical profession. We throw out a drug and then we send them home. And that's why some of these hospitals and universities and all are trying to teach you guys, you need to take one step further. You need to go a little bit further with this patient, and you need to explain to them that this is a disease and that they need to take care of the disease. Now, one of the questions is, how do we take care of this disease? They're in exhaustion. If we don't do something for them, they are going to die. And all you just did is gave them a sugar cookie and sent them home with that drug. You did not take care of their disease. You did not even try to help to heal them. What are you going to do instead? Lifestyle changes. Well, how the crud are you all who are in college, totally stressed out, going to change your lifestyle?
Maybe ask about a diet.
Okay, good. There's one possibility. Maybe they just eat junk food all day. What else? Exercise. Okay, so the question before by Alicia was, Why does exercise help with stress? Okay? And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So just be aware of that. What exercise does is once I'm done exercising, it turns that off. Exercise suppresses the ability of the hypothalamus to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. Now watch, if I can turn off the sympathetic nervous system, what am I doing to all these effects?
They're going to be decreased.
They're going to be decreased or they're going to go away at least for a little while after I exercise. I can bring them all back by stressing out again. But the exercise actually can turn that off. Now here's one of the problems though. Y'all are in college and you're stressed out. What if I tell you, you have to exercise, it's the way that it's going to cure your stress? Do you agree with me? No. I see a lot of heads going, no. I don't see anybody doing this, yes. Why is it not going to decrease your stress?
Because you're forcing us
Right
to.
back to it, it's just.
Yeah, it's going to make you feel good for a while. It's going to help a little bit. It'll decrease all those effects. Are you going to do it? No. Why? You're friggin' stressed about working out. Where are you going to fit working out into your life, okay? You're so busy already. How are you going to fit this into your life? And now you know that I'm correct and you need to exercise. Did it just stress you out more? Of course it did. So be careful with telling your patient you have to exercise. It's going to make you feel better. Because it just might not, depending on the person, because their lives are so fragile already, because they're so packed full of everything. They're looking at this going, I don't know how to get exercise into my life. I already can't sleep. I'm supposed to exercise, what, at 3 o'clock in the morning? It's about the only time I have. So now what are you going to do? And it is helpful. There's no doubt. If they can do it, this would be great for them. But now how are you going to help your patient? You see, this is hard.
Therapy, but again, when do they have time for that?
Well, therapy may be only maybe 30 minutes a week. Okay?
In some aspects, you could try spirituality.
Okay, so let's go with therapy for a second. There are a lot of different types of therapy, even free therapy, that people can go to. For instance, if your patient needs to go to therapy, Loma Linda University has a therapy program. It's their family and marital therapy program, and the patient pays on a sliding scale. This is good for your patients to know. And that means that if they're very poor, they pay $0. So you can go to therapy and you might pay $5 for that therapy. You might pay nothing. You may pay $25 for the therapy. And it could be your patient may only have to go one time. They help them to get their lives in order a little bit. Let's look at your life. Let's see what you need to have, what you don't need to have in your life. Maybe you can throw a few things out, put a couple different things in. So sometimes it's a good thing because, you know, sometimes our families are driving us crazy. And how do we deal with them, okay? That husband, that wife, that mom, that dad, those kids, maybe learning how to deal with them is going to be very helpful. Learning how to do things a little different, schedule your life a little differently could be very helpful. Yes, it is difficult to get into the therapy sometimes. But one of the biggest complaints will be for your patient is, I can't afford it. That's going to be the biggest complaint. And the answer is, oh yeah, actually you can. Because I have a place you could go to that, you know, could be free or very inexpensive for you. And all they have to do is call Loma Linda and say, I'd like to talk to your marriage and family therapy clinic. And they'll get them in. And we also have a branch of it up in the high desert, so they don't have to drive all the way down the hill, so they can come to the clinic up here as well. So that's a very important thing. Now somebody else said spirituality. Okay. So maybe your patient believes in a higher power. Now it doesn't matter if you do, but if they do, that's very important to them. So the American Medical Association says the #1 way to relieve stress in your patient is to tell them to pray. Above anything else, exercise, therapy, anything you do, this is the best way to relieve stress. Why? So you're talking your problems out to somebody who won't tell anybody, right? Okay? You can be sure they're not going to be tattling on you. And you're also releasing a lot of those issues. And if you believe who you're talking to is a great mighty power, You just like, here's my problem, okay? I'm done with it, dude, take care of it. You just got rid of your problem. If that patient truly believes that this is their God that can take care of that problem, did that not just relieve their stress? Absolutely. It's a fantastic stress relief. And again, I'm not concerned about what you believe in. It's just that when that person believes in it, it really helps them with their stress relief. If you can have somebody else take care of all your problems, wouldn't you like that? I know I would. That'd be fantastic. Here you go.
Well, isn't anxiety the belief of something going to happen that necessarily might not?
Yeah, that's part of it, yes. Or anxiety is also not being able to control the issues in your life. So a lot of our anxiety comes from we fear that things are going to be out of control. And I have super control issues. I want to be able to control the world, and nobody can control the world. And so I feel very anxious about that.
How would a good physician diagnose this? Because if they were good, right, I mean, they'd know it was general adaptation and they wouldn't give them pills. Maybe they'd refer them to a therapist. Or, I mean, would it just be the cortisol levels are high, or what would they?
So let me just explain one thing to you. Your physician none of them get this lecture in medical school. Okay? So I'm teaching you something that the general adaptation syndrome is not part of the curriculum of medical school, which is really sad, and it should be. So most of your physicians can't diagnose this. And they, like I said, you will not find physicians who take cortisol levels. If you went into your doctor and said, I want my cortisol levels checked, I'm not kidding you, they'll laugh at you. And they'll say there's no need for that. There's a rare doctor who's willing to check your cortisol levels. Now, by the way, if you want your cortisol levels checked, you can buy a cortisol checking kit on Amazon.
Oh, you can?
Yeah. I think it's like $120. You can check your own cortisol levels. How cool is that? Then it can tell you how stressed or not stressed you are, how likely you will be to get XYZ disease or not. It's pretty cool. And like I said, all you do is spit in a tube, put it in a box, and send it back, and they send you your results. And of course, those results are from a qualified laboratory, so you could even take those results to your doctor, and maybe the doctor would look at them. If they don't look at them, you might want to find another doctor. That's just all I have to say. But how would a doctor diagnose this? Not easily. Most of them are not qualified to make a diagnosis of mood disorder.
So would that be along the lines of a psychiatrist then?
Yes, but, okay, let me just tell you one thing, and I'm glad you brought that up, Greg, because one of the things about a therapist versus a psychiatrist. Therapists are taught to deal with our everyday problems. Crap that happens with our family, stuff that we go through in life. That's what a therapist deals with. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They've gone through medical school. They have their license to practice medicine. But what they are proficient in is they are proficient in very serious mental illness. So usually schizophrenia, psychotic illnesses, that type of thing. Most of your therapists are not taught, most of your psychiatrists are not taught how to do therapy. Which is really sad because the insurance that your patients have almost never pays for therapy, but it pays for a psychiatrist. If the insurance companies were smart, they would pay for therapists because the scientific studies show that people who are ill from stress, who go through therapy, typically don't use insurance quite as much. They don't go to the doctors as much. They save money. But they will send you to a psychiatrist who is not equipped to give you therapy. They're equipped to give you pills. It's an unusual psychiatrist who is equipped to do therapy.
So would they be the ones to diagnose the mood disorder then?
Yes. Yes. Although they typically can't help you with it. So what they usually do is they give you a bunch of pills and send you home.
And like you said, this one's not popular, so it gets brushed under the rug, right?
Exactly.
No, they don't even know what it is.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it is very important for you, who's working with your patients on a daily basis in the hospital, to just be aware that many of them are there due to stress issues. And just watch and see, is there anything that you can do? You are allowed to suggest therapy for that patient. You're allowed to talk to them about things. There's nothing illegal about that. A friend of my daughter's was in the hospital at St. Mary's not too long ago, complaining of all kinds of abdominal pain. And one of the nurses came in, who just also happened to be one of my former students. And my daughter was there at the time. She didn't know it was my daughter. And the nurse walked up and said, you know, we've done all kinds of tests. The doctors have run all kinds of GI tests, and they can't find anything wrong with you. They're going to be sending you home with certain types of medication which may help, but I'd like to recommend to you that you go to a therapist. Now that's not easy to do, because this young lady blew up at the nurse. Now she's lucky because my daughter was standing right there and said, you know what, she's right. You are acting crazy, you need to see a therapist. That's what friends are for too. But the nurse was right. And all of it was due to anxiety issues in her life. Her husband had just died, and they had lost their house, and there was a whole bunch of other things. And of course, you get abdominal issues from that. Who doesn't? And so she's since then gone to therapy, which has helped tremendously. So there are a lot of different things that you can do, and you just have to be very aware, not only for yourself, but for your patients as well.
How does the aromatherapy work? Is that actually...
Yes, it does. It actually works very well. So really what you're seeing is you're seeing certain chemicals that an individual is inhaling, and those chemicals that they're inhaling actually work on the neurons of your brain. So for instance, the chemicals that are coming from aromatherapy from lavender, okay, has been shown scientifically to enhance the neurons of the immune system so that your immune response goes up. It also enhances certain neurons in your brain that help to calm brain activity so you're much more likely to sleep. So there's certain combinations of these chemicals that do affect the body and can increase mood or decrease mood, and they work directly on neurotransmitter release in the brain. So it might sound really funny, but it does really work.
Kind of like we were talking about not phono transduction, but we were talking about memories of the sense.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Now, of course, if you can't get your patient to do something different, and they keep it up and the same stress levels occur, you unfortunately are going to die. Now, let me just tell you one thing. Typically, we see the stress issue kill somebody, and it takes a long time for this to occur. You could be talking 20, 30 years, okay? Stress causes high blood pressure, causes clogs in the arteries to occur, all this other stuff, and it's a slow killer. Or you could see stress kill somebody very quickly, okay? I'll give you one example. I have a friend who, in 1 week, her father died in an automobile accident. The same week, in a different accident, 2 of her sons died. The same week, in a different accident, her uncle died. And there was a 5th one, I can't remember who it was. But all in 1 week, 5 different male relatives died in automobile accidents. Talk about an unlucky week. Now, of course, we're talking maximum amounts of stress here. Her children, her father, close relatives, all dying. And her husband, luckily for her, is actually a doctor who works at Kaiser in Fontana, and he also is one of the lead doctors that does like the stress seminars and things like that. And his response was, well, we need to watch her closely because she's going to become very ill. And sure enough, her stress levels were so high because of all of this, within 6 months, she had to have a double mastectomy because she had developed cancer in both breasts. That's high cortisol, super low immune system, got cancer just like that. Now, lucky for her, she didn't die because they were watching her and they knew something bad was going to happen. But you're talking a very short period of time where it could have potentially killed her. And we see this a lot like with spouses. You have a husband and wife who maybe have been married for many, many years, and one of the spouses dies. It is unusual for the other spouse to live through the entire next year. It is much more likely that that spouse is going to die. because the stress levels are so high in their lives, something happens, and within a year's period of time, they're deceased. That's very common.
Now, is that just due to the ones that have been together a long time, or could it just be someone maybe like this, been together for a year and they're just like, oh, we so in love, then one passed away?
You know what? That's very interesting. Usually you don't see that really in somebody who's only been together for a year. It's usually the people who have been together for many, many, many years. So probably they're in love, but they're not that in love.
More of like a dependent type thing for the ones that have been together so
Yes,
long.
I think
they
so.
could,
I think so, yes. Yeah, yes, there's a lot of that bonding that happens, and if they don't die, they typically remarry in that year. Tell you a funny story and then we'll take a break. Knew a lady who, she was 96 years old, and her husband died, and he was 97. She had married him when she was 16, so they had been together for 80 years. He was 17, she was 16, and he died. So obviously, not good. Within 6 months, she was remarried. At 96 years of age, she was remarried. They both lived for another 8 years together. They were in their hundreds. Yeah, that's what I said. Dang, good for you. Okay. So she made sure she lived. Found herself another man, and off she went and was happy. So sometimes that is what people will do so that they don't feel so alone. Any other questions? Okay, so remember, for your exam, okay, not next week, the week after, we've gone through the essays. So we've talked about the neuron, and you know the neuron for sure is going to be an essay. And then we went through the eye with general adaptation syndrome. So with general adaptation syndrome, you're going to talk about the rod, and you're going to talk about how the lights get turned on and what happens to the rod. And then you're going to...
Yeah, you're saying general
adaptation.
Sorry, my brain is running away with itself and I'm not thinking. So thank you so much. So with phototransduction, let's back up. You're going to talk about the rod, and you're going to talk about when lights turn on and what happens to the rod, and then when lights turn off and what happens to the rod. Now with general adaptation syndrome, you're going to walk me through the 4 phases. You're going to talk about alarm and all the hormonal changes that are going on in the alarm phase. And tell me it goes from 0 to 2 weeks. And then you're going to go into the resistance phase. And in the resistance phase, you're going to say, so after 2 weeks, we're in resistance. And the body's going to try to downregulate to get all these effects under control. Unfortunately, we can't downregulate against cortisol because it's a steroid. And so cortisol, when it's high, does this to us. Okay? Then you're going to talk about the patient moving into the exhaustion phase. And from the exhaustion phase, we know, or from resistance to exhaustion, we know they had all these symptoms, but they weren't diagnosable. But now, unfortunately, something bad has happened, and they are diagnosable. So we know that we walk into exhaustion because we're now clinically diagnosable with a problem. Okay? And then you're going to tell me, I think I asked for 3 different things on your essay, that your patient could do to prevent them from possibly dying. So we talk about exercise or diet, prayer, meditation, just those things. I just want you to list them. You don't have to tell me all about it.
Divorcing, remarrying.
Yeah, possibly. That could mean more stress, okay?
No, she's saying right things that would help.
Things that would help, yes. Well, he's saying that new life may help the situation.
Maybe, yeah.
Probably not, but anyway. Just pick right the first